There are ideas so dangerous they've been censored, burned, buried, not because they were false, but because they were too true. Truths that cut deep, that shatter beliefs, that challenge everything you've been taught about morality, God, freedom, even the value of human life. In this video, we're diving into the most forbidden ideas in the history of philosophy, thoughts that shook empires, outraged churches, and landed their authors in prison or exile. Get ready. Nothing you believe is safe. Welcome to the dark side of reason. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is philosophy at its most dangerous. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche delivers one of the most explosive critiques in the history of philosophy. The idea that traditional morality, especially Christian morality, wasn't born from virtue, but from resentment. To him, so-called moral values that praise humility, obedience, and compassion weren't created by the strong or the noble, but by the weak, as a form of symbolic revenge. In ancient times, Nietzsche says, values were defined by the masters, warriors, aristocrats, those who embraced life with pride, courage, and power. Master morality said, good is strength, beauty, and nobility. But the slaves, the oppressed, the powerless, the bitter, couldn't fight back directly, so they flipped the script. They called weakness good. Obedience became a virtue. Humility became holiness. Suffering was glorified. This shift, which Nietzsche calls the transvaluation of values, was a silent revolution, not with swords, but with words. It's not just a theory, but a powerful warning. The values we've been taught as universal truths may actually be strategies of self-protection from those without power. Worse, they may have been designed to tame, suppress, and guilt-trip the most vital human instincts: strength, desire, and self-affirmation. He calls it herd morality, a moral code that pulls everyone down to the same level, fears what's different, and represses creativity, risk, and the power to live fully. For Nietzsche, this morality weakens humanity. Instead of raising authentic individuals, it produces submission, guilt, and conformity. Instead of greatness, it breeds mediocrity. But be careful. Nietzsche isn't saying that all morality is fake or worthless. He's urging us to ask deeper questions. Where do our values come from? Who benefits from them? Do they affirm life or deny it? That's the true genealogy Nietzsche wants us to trace. So now I ask you, the values you hold, are they really yours? Or were they planted there to quietly tame your strength? In The Rebel, Albert Camus wrestles with one of the most haunting questions of the 20th century. Is it ever right to kill for a cause? More specifically, is murder justified if the goal is to free humanity from oppression? Camus starts with the figure of the rebel, the person who, faced with injustice, says no. But that no isn't just destructive, it's also a yes. It's a refusal to be humiliated, but also a demand for dignity. The problem is that, throughout history, that refusal has often crossed the line into terror. Revolutions that began in the name of freedom ended in bloodshed. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, all raised the banner of justice, but walked a path drenched in violence. Camus then makes a radical critique of the idea that the ends justify the means. To him, when someone kills in the name of an absolute ideal, like total freedom or perfect justice, they end up denying the very thing they wanted to defend, the value of human life. Murder, even when done for noble political or philosophical reasons, always carries a contradiction. To free humanity, must you destroy it? Camus' existentialism holds that no ideal is worth the life of another. Killing a man is closing off all his possibilities, he writes. No cause, no matter how noble, has the right to become a new form of tyranny. Freedom that kills in its own name is no longer freedom, it's fanaticism. But this doesn't mean giving in or staying silent. Camus doesn't call for resignation in the face of injustice. Quite the opposite. He believes in ethical rebellion, action with limits. The true rebel, Camus says, refuses to become like the oppressor. They act, they resist, but they refuse to turn their fight into a new domination. And that's Camus' most painful lesson. To fight for freedom is also to accept the limits of your own power. It means saying no to murder, even when your heart screams for justice. So what do you think? Are there causes so righteous they could justify taking a life? Or is every act of killing, even for freedom, a moral defeat? In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche launches a bold attack on the traditional idea of morality. He argues that the belief in absolute good and evil is an illusion, a historical, cultural, and psychological construction that hides the real power dynamics behind moral judgments. His core question is sharp. What if what we call immoral is just an interpretation, shaped by specific worldviews and interests? Nietzsche claims there are no universal moral facts, only interpretations that change depending on who's judging. An act condemned by one culture might be praised by another. Adultery, suicide, revenge, violence, all of these have been seen as either virtues or crimes, depending on time, place, and perspective. This is the heart of Nietzsche's Perspectivism. Morality isn't built into the nature of things, it's in how we see them. And that vision is never neutral. It's shaped by inherited values, resentments, and systems of power that decide what should be praised and what must be condemned. So when someone says that's wrong, Nietzsche invites us to ask, according to whom? Who gains from calling it wrong? Who loses? This isn't about justifying everything. It's about revealing how morality can be used as a weapon to control, shame, and exclude. Nietzsche goes further. Many so-called good actions are actually signs of weakness, like compassion that hides superiority, or humility that masks fear. And the opposite is also true. Some bad acts may express strength, creativity, or life affirmation. But don't misunderstand, Nietzsche's not calling for chaos or shallow relativism. He's calling for a revaluation, a deep, honest reassessment of the values we've inherited. Instead of blindly following a moral code handed down to us, Nietzsche urges us to create our own values, ones rooted in life, authenticity, and freedom from dogma. So here's the challenge. Is what you call wrong really immoral, or were you just taught to see it that way? Drop your thoughts below. Is there, in your opinion, any act that's absolutely wrong, no matter the time, culture, or situation? For Spinoza, the idea of sin isn't just theological. It's also political, psychological, and deeply limiting. In his work Ethics, he proposes a radical break from the Judeo-Christian moral tradition, which equates goodness with obedience and evil with disobedience. Instead of a world ruled by guilt, Spinoza offers a vision guided by reason, freedom, and natural necessity. Sin, in his view, is a human invention, more specifically, a religious invention used to keep people under control. The idea that certain actions are inherently evil and offensive to a punishing God is, according to Spinoza, rooted in fear and ignorance. Sin comes from superstition. When we don't understand the causes of things, we create higher powers to punish us for what we can't explain. Unlike sin, which implies guilt, punishment, and submission, Spinoza offers the concept of error, a mistake in understanding, something that can be corrected through knowledge and reflection. No one sins against God. Instead, we act against our own nature because we don't understand ourselves or the forces that drive us. Moral freedom, then, doesn't come through confession or penance, but through clarity and self-knowledge. This perspective turns traditional ethics on its head. The goal of life isn't to obey, but to understand. True freedom, for Spinoza, means acting according to reason, not according to rules imposed from the outside. That's why he heavily criticizes the psychological impact of the concept of sin. It creates fear, repression, and dependence on external authority, the opposite of the rational freedom he defends. Spinoza isn't an atheist in the traditional sense. He believes in God, but not in a God who judges, punishes, or demands worship. His God is nature itself, an infinite, impersonal substance. In this universe, there's no room for sin, because everything that exists necessarily, not as a failure, but as an expression of a rational order we can come to understand. Spinoza's question still echoes today. Is the guilt we carry truly spiritual, or was it planted in us as a tool of control? So, what do you think? Should we let go of the idea of sin, or does it still serve a meaningful role in people's moral lives? François de la Rochefoucauld, one of the sharpest minds among the French moralists, raised a disturbing question about virtue. Are our noblest, most selfless actions really just clever forms of self-interest? In his Maxims, La Rochefoucauld writes, "Our virtues are often only disguised vices." With short, piercing reflections, he exposes the double nature of human behavior. For him, we are rarely driven by high-minded principles. Behind generosity often lies the desire for approval. Behind humility, vanity. Even sacrifice can be a form of moral self-promotion. His critique doesn't deny that virtuous actions exist. It questions their true motivation. La Rochefoucauld didn't see people as inherently evil, but as masters of self-deception. Our greatest talent, he suggests, may be the ability to dress up our interests in moral clothing. This way of thinking was shared by other moralists of his time, like Montaigne and Pascal, and it anticipates major themes in modern psychology. The idea that we're driven by unconscious forces, that altruism might contain doses of narcissism, and that moral judgments often act as tools of social distinction. All of this can be found between the lines of these thinkers. La Rochefoucauld didn't write like a traditional philosopher. He observed, satirized, exposed. His goal wasn't to make us cynical, but to make us see clearly. He didn't want to destroy virtue, just strip away the illusions surrounding it. By showing that even our highest acts may serve the ego, he offers a new kind of honesty, not moral perfection, but the courage to face our contradictions. True virtue, perhaps, doesn't mean denying selfishness, but knowing how to live with it, and maybe even direct it toward the common good. Which brings us to the tough question: have you ever done good hoping to be recognized? Helped someone deep down because you wanted to be admired for it? The idea that evil is somehow necessary or inevitable has haunted philosophy and theology for centuries. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a 17th century rationalist philosopher, is perhaps the most famous defender of the notion that evil, though real, plays a role in a greater universal balance. In his work, Theodicy, he claimed, "We live in the best of all possible worlds." This idea shocked many and inspired one of the most biting critiques in philosophy, Candide by Voltaire. According to Leibniz, a perfectly good, wise, and powerful God wouldn't have created an imperfect world without reason. He argued that evil exists, but only as a part of a larger harmony that ultimately leads to the greatest possible good. Pain, for example, may be bad individually, but is essential to alert us to danger. Death may seem tragic, but is necessary for the cycle of life to continue. Evil, then, isn't a design flaw. It's the lesser evil required in an otherwise perfect divine plan. Without contrast, we couldn't recognize good. Without shadow, there's no light. Then came Voltaire, witnessing the catastrophic Lisbon earthquake of 1755, a disaster that killed tens of thousands, including churchgoers crushed during Mass. Horrified, he asked, "Is this really part of the best possible world?" In Candide, his protagonist is a naive young man trained in Leibniz's philosophy, represented by the character Pangloss, who keeps repeating the best of all possible worlds mantra, even as he witnesses war, rape, hunger, and misery. Voltaire's satire lands a powerful blow. Justifying suffering for the sake of some greater good can be cold and dangerous. He challenges the idea that all pain has meaning, accusing philosophers of hiding real anguish behind metaphysical excuses. The debate continues. Does accepting evil as necessary make us wiser or just numb? Does finding meaning in suffering help us heal or blind us to injustice? And you? Do you think evil might be part of a bigger plan? Or are there pains that should never happen under any circumstance? Tell us in the comments, and share this video with someone who's asked that question too. Peter Singer, one of the most controversial philosophers today, forces us to confront moral dilemmas we'd rather avoid. Grounded in utilitarianism, his thinking revolves around a simple yet deeply unsettling idea. Actions should be judged based on their consequences, with the goal of reducing suffering and increasing well-being for the greatest number of sentient beings. But what happens when we take that logic to the extreme? Singer argues that in some cases, killing might not only be morally acceptable, but morally necessary, if it's the only way to prevent even greater future suffering. This idea clashes with traditional values that see life as sacred in itself. For Singer's utilitarianism, the value of life doesn't lie in simply being alive, but in the capacity to feel pleasure, pain, desire, and fear. That's what gives a being moral significance. One of the most controversial examples comes from his book, Practical Ethics, where he discusses newborns with incurable diseases and extreme suffering. If the life ahead is going to be short, filled with pain, and without any chance for consciousness or joy, is it ethical to prolong it at all costs? Or paradoxically, would it be more compassionate to end it? Singer also extends these reflections to non-human animals. A pig, capable of feeling pain and pleasure, might have more moral weight than a human in a permanent vegetative state. What's shocking is not the coldness, but the consistency with which Singer applies his principle. Reduce suffering. Period. Still, this approach raises difficult questions. How far can we go in predicting someone's future suffering? Who gets to decide that a life isn't worth living? Are we at risk of justifying irreversible actions based on assumptions? Singer pushes us out of our moral comfort zones. He doesn't offer easy answers. He demands moral courage to face the implications of our own values. And the question that lingers is haunting. Is preserving a life at any cost always the most ethical choice? What do you think? Are there situations where ending a life could be the lesser evil, or does this open a dangerous door? Nietzsche, arguably the most ruthless critic of Western morality, challenges us to rethink even the things we consider unquestionably good, like compassion. In works like The Antichrist and On the Genealogy of Morality, he suggests that pity, far from being a noble gesture, can actually be a subtle form of domination. But how could that be? For Nietzsche, Christian compassion, celebrated as the highest virtue, operates with a twisted logic. It frames the other as weak, sick, and needy. When you pity someone, you're not just acknowledging their suffering, you're reinforcing it. You become the superior person offering help, the good one who sacrifices, while the other is reduced to a passive object of care, powerless, inferior, dependent. In this sense, compassion can become a mask for moral vanity, a way to feel superior. Helping someone isn't always an act of selflessness. It can also be a subtle way of placing yourself above them, of asserting control. Nietzsche saw this morality of pity as a direct inheritance from Christianity, which glorifies suffering, idealizes the weak, and turns pain into virtue. He viewed it as a herd morality, designed to bring everyone down to the same level in the name of equality, but at the cost of greatness, strength, and the affirmation of life. To him, compassion can actually block growth. By rushing to relieve someone's suffering, we might prevent them from overcoming it. As he writes in The Antichrist, pity thwarts the law of evolution. It preserves what is ripe for destruction. Instead of encouraging strength and self-transcendence, pity can freeze someone in their pain. This doesn't mean Nietzsche promoted cold indifference. He believed true respect for others means recognizing their capacity, not constantly trying to save them. So the real question isn't just, how can I help? But am I truly helping? Or just keeping this person dependent on my kindness? Have you ever wondered if your compassion might have actually been a subtle form of control? Edward O. Wilson, founder of modern sociobiology, offers a bold perspective. Human morality may not be a divine gift or a purely cultural construct. It could be an evolutionary adaptation. In other words, what we now call universal ethics may have emerged because it helped groups survive. According to Wilson, moral behaviors like empathy, justice, fairness, and even altruism evolved because they encouraged group cohesion. In hostile environments, tribes that cooperated, punished cheaters, and looked out for each other were more likely to survive than those that didn't. So morality wasn't selected because it was good, but because it was useful. This idea breaks from centuries of tradition. Philosophers have long claimed that morality comes from reason, like Kant, divine revelation, like theologians, or culture, like modern relativists. Wilson introduces a fourth option. Morality is, at its core, biological. That means we feel guilt, shame, or compassion not because we've rationally chosen to, but because we're, at least partly, wired to. As he writes in On Human Nature, ethics is not just a cultural invention, it's deeply rooted in our biology. But this idea raises big questions. If morality is shaped by biology, what happens to free will? If our values are products of evolution, how do we separate what is from what ought to be? After all, nature also selected for aggression, deceit, and selfishness. So does that mean those traits are morally acceptable too? And if morality is evolutionary, can it change? Or are we trapped by our genetic programming? Wilson doesn't argue for strict determinism, but he believes that understanding the biological roots of morality is key to building a more realistic ethics, one that doesn't deny human nature but works with it. For him, we'll only create more just societies if we accept that our sense of right and wrong comes from a constant tension between instinct and reason, between our animal past and our civilizing hopes. So what do you think? Are our moral values conscious choices, or echoes of a long evolutionary struggle for survival? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and share this video with anyone who's fascinated by the intersection of biology, philosophy, and the human mind. Karl Marx didn't see morality as neutral or universal. In his view, the dominant ethics of any era reflect the interests of the ruling class. In other words, what's considered right or wrong in a capitalist society doesn't come from pure reason or eternal values, but from bourgeois ideology designed to preserve the system. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels write, "The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. That includes morality. Values like merit, hard work, obedience to the law, and private property are treated as timeless virtues. But are they really just symbolic tools to protect the privileges of the few? From this perspective, bourgeois ethics present themselves as universal, but are actually deeply biased. They legitimize inequality as natural, paint rebellion as immoral, and glorify charity over justice." Marx isn't saying all morality is false, but he argues that any moral code used to justify exploitation is ideological, a veil hiding the real class struggles. Think about the worker who feels guilty for not trying hard enough, even while generating wealth they'll never enjoy, or the entrepreneur praised as a moral hero, even if they profit from unfair labor conditions. This morality of hard work and discipline, celebrated under capitalism, is sold as virtue, but might actually suppress collective liberation. Marx proposes a different kind of ethics, not based on abstract commandments, but on praxis, the concrete transformation of social relations. He's less interested in asking, what is good, and more concerned with who benefits from this good, and what structures make it possible. The Marxist critique of morality isn't a call for nihilism. On the contrary, it's a call to build a new ethical foundation, one based on solidarity, not charity, on historical action, not passive acceptance, a morality that reveals power instead of hiding it. And here's the question that won't go away. Are the values that govern our world truly fair, or just convenient for those already at the top? The famous phrase "God is dead" appears first in The Gay Science and later is taken up even more strongly in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But what did Nietzsche actually mean by it? He's not talking about the literal death of a divine being. To him, God symbolizes the absolute values that supported Western culture for centuries, especially Christian values. Saying God is dead means those foundations have crumbled. It's not a hasty celebration. First and foremost, it's a tragic diagnosis. The death of God means there is no final truth guaranteed by a supreme authority. There is no intrinsic good, universal purpose, or cosmic judge to impose order on chaos. What remains? An abyss, a void of meaning. But Nietzsche doesn't recoil from that abyss. Instead, he asks, what if this void is actually an opportunity? What if, free from dogmas, we can forge our own values? That is the liberation he proposes. Liberation, not in the easy sense of do whatever you want, but in becoming responsible for yourself, your choices, judgments, your path. The death of God dismantles the metaphysical crutches underpinning traditional morality. There are no longer eternal commandments, only life, instinct, will. Nietzsche calls this shift a transvaluation of values, to stop living by inherited standards and instead create a new ethics, one more vital, more affirming. But beware, this kind of freedom isn't for everyone. It demands courage. Many, without God, will fall into nihilism, the feeling that nothing has value anymore. Others will look for new idols, new absolutes to obey. Only a few dare to face the responsibility of living without guarantees. Nietzsche calls those people free spirits. That's why the death of God isn't just collapse, it's also a possible rebirth. An invitation to cast aside comforting illusions and live honestly. No sense is given to life, but there is the possibility of giving life meaning. And you? What would you do if you knew there was no one watching from above? Does that terrify you or set you free? 12. Is religion the opium of the people? Karl Marx. The phrase, religion is the opium of the people, is perhaps one of Marx's most quoted and most misunderstood statements. Far from being a simple anti-religion provocation, it is part of a far deeper critique of the social structures that produce and sustain faith as a need. In Hegel's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx writes, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the spirit of a spiritless situation. It is the opium of the people." In other words, religion is not just an illusion, it is also a comfort. It arises in response to real suffering, material deprivation, and alienation. Like opium, it soothes pain, gives hope, and offers meaning to lives marked by exploitation and injustice. And that's precisely the problem for Marx. To him, religion offers an escape, a momentary relief that prevents transformative action. By promising reward after death, it leads the poor to accept present misery as part of a divine plan. By glorifying humility, obedience, and suffering, it weakens revolt, class consciousness, and the indignation that could spark change. Marx's critique is not aimed at personal faith, but at religion as a social and historical institution. He saw churches, especially when tied to political power, as tools of maintaining the status quo. A social order rooted in inequality, where faith acts as a buffer against revolt. So Marx doesn't deny the human value of religion. He recognizes it expresses desires for justice, comfort, and transcendence. But he believes those desires must be realized here, in this world, not deferred to a distant afterlife. Rather than sedate people with promises of heaven, he wants us to transform material conditions on earth. For that, critique of religion is a first step. Not to destroy spirituality, but to free it from alienation. As he said, the criticism of religion is the beginning of all criticism. And you, what do you think? Does religion soothe or lull people to submission? Does it liberate or keep them under control? Faced with the silence of the universe, the limits of reason, and the fragility of existence, comes the question, is faith a blind leap or a vital need? For Blaise Pascal, the 17th century mathematician and Christian thinker, human reason is too limited to reach God. In his Pensées, he writes, "The heart has its reasons which reason does not know." That is, faith doesn't arise from logic, but from an inner, emotional, existential necessity. Pascal argues that living without faith is a risky bet. If God exists and you do not believe, you lose everything. If God does not exist and you believe, you lose little. This is his famous Pascal's wager. But that faith is not purely a rational calculation. It emerges from the awareness of life's emptiness without transcendence, from the recognition that humans are both noble in thought and miserable in mortality. Faith, then, is a kind of necessary self-deception, yes, but one that supports life in the face of absurdity. Søren Kierkegaard, in the 19th century, pushes this idea further. He accepts that belief in God is irrational, cannot be justified by arguments. In Fear and Trembling, he describes faith as a leap into the dark, a leap made by Abraham when asked to sacrifice his son, not because it made sense, but because he trusted God despite it all. To Kierkegaard, faith is paradoxical. It defies universal ethics, common sense, logic, yet it has value precisely because of that. To believe is to endure the anxiety of no guarantees, to assert meaning even when everything points otherwise. It's not illusion, it's courage, not an escape from truth, but facing it fully and still saying yes. Both Pascal and Kierkegaard know that faith is, from a rational perspective, indefensible, but they also know that living without it can lead to despair, nihilism, or paralysis. So faith may be a self-deception, but a vital one. Not because it falsifies reality, but because it sustains existence when reason alone is not enough. And you? Do you believe faith is a necessary comfort for facing life's absurdities, or a barrier to clarity? Comment below, and share this video with anyone caught between reason and belief. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche delivers one of the fiercest attacks ever made against Christianity. But he doesn't accuse it of physical oppression. He accuses it of enslaving the human spirit through ideas. To Nietzsche, Christian morality is a value system that denies life, suppresses strength, and turns natural virtues into sins. He doesn't see Christianity as a religion of love and compassion. To him, it's a religion of resentment. Early Christians, he argues, were the weak, the marginalized, the sick, people who had no power in the Roman world. Unable to compete with the strong, they flipped the value system. They labeled pride, strength, sexuality, and joy as evil, and praised weakness, submission, humility, and suffering as good. This moral reversal is what Nietzsche calls slave morality. It's born not from power, but from negation. It denies earthly life in favor of an afterlife. It denies instincts in favor of purity. It denies the body in favor of the soul. It made people feel guilty for being human, taught them to hate their own desires, and turned obedience into a virtue. Interestingly, Nietzsche sees Jesus not as the problem, but as a kind of free spirit who lived without hate or resentment. The real betrayal, he says, came from the church, which twisted Jesus' legacy. It invented dogmas, hierarchies, sin, and hell, all as tools to control people and keep them obedient. In Nietzsche's view, Christian morality doesn't liberate us. It cages our will to power, that inner drive to create, to transform, to affirm life. Instead of teaching people to live fully and bravely, it taught them to kneel, to deny themselves, and to wait for a reward in the afterlife. But Nietzsche isn't calling for chaos or moral anarchy. He calls for a revaluation of all values, a shift from the morality of denial to one of affirmation, a morality of strength, self-creation, and inner freedom. He challenges us to break the idea that being good means being obedient, and instead to celebrate those who dare to live fully. And you? Do you think Christian morality sets the spirit free or holds it back? Richard Dawkins, evolutionary biologist and author of The God Delusion, became one of the leading voices of the new atheism movement. His message is bold and controversial. Religion isn't just false, it's a real threat to human progress. For him, blind, dogmatic, institutional faith can no longer be treated as a personal choice. It must be challenged with reason, science, and critical thinking. It's a bold claim. Dawkins argues that religion, especially the traditional monotheistic kind, promotes irrational thinking, blocks scientific progress, fuels fanaticism, and is behind wars, sexual repression, prejudice, and cultural divisions. Teaching a child that they belong to a religion, he says, is a form of intellectual abuse. For Dawkins and other new atheists, science is our best tool to understand the world, solve real problems, and build fairer societies. Religion, in this view, is a leftover from primitive times, a kind of mind virus passed from generation to generation, built on fear, tradition, and blind authority, not evidence. But is erasing religion really the path to progress? Even many secular thinkers push back. Critics say religion isn't a single block. There are faith communities that promote justice, freedom, and even critical thinking, and many argue that humans have a deep need for meaning, something logic and data alone can't fully replace. Others point out that atheist regimes in the 20th century, like Stalin's USSR, also committed atrocities in the name of reason and progress. Maybe the real issue isn't religion itself, but fanaticism, whether religious or secular. Dawkins believes we can be moral without God, and many philosophers agree. But can we live without symbols, myths, rituals? If religion disappears, will we just replace it with new beliefs? Political, ideological, or consumerist? So, what do you think? Does human progress require the end of religion, or just a deep transformation of it? Emile Durkheim, one of the founders of modern sociology, offered a radical rethinking of religion. It's not a divine revelation, but a collective creation. In his book, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, Durkheim argued that the sacred doesn't come from outside the world, it comes from within society itself. Religion, he believed, first emerged in early tribal communities as a social necessity. It served as a symbolic system to unite the group, create cohesion, and establish norms. When people worshipped a god, they were really, without realizing it, worshipping society itself, imagined as a higher power. To Durkheim, the divide between sacred and profane is a basic feature of all religions. But it's not natural, it's constructed. Certain objects, rituals, and spaces gain symbolic meaning because they help strengthen group identity. A totem might represent a god, but what it truly stands for is the tribe and its values. This changes everything. Religion isn't a mirror of eternal truths, it's a reflection of social needs. Faith, in this sense, is less about the supernatural and more about the we. Gods don't create societies, societies create gods. But Durkheim doesn't mock religion. In fact, he sees it as crucial to human history. Through religion, groups learn to organize, share a sense of belonging, and develop ethical norms. Even in modern, secular societies, religious elements live on in symbolic forms. Flags, anthems, patriotic holidays, all act as modern rituals that keep the sacred alive. So if the sacred is a tribal invention, maybe it's also a necessary one, a symbolic answer to the question, who are we together? What about you? Do you believe the sacred comes from the divine or from our human need to belong? Share your thoughts in the comments and send this to someone who sees religion as more than belief, someone who sees it as a mirror of society itself. When we hear the word religion, we usually picture a powerful creator God who rules the universe and judges our actions. But what if religion didn't require a God? Could there be a spiritual path without a personal deity? For many thinkers and traditions, the answer is yes, and it's not a new idea. Take Buddhism, for example, one of the oldest religions in the world. It doesn't revolve around a creator god. Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, didn't teach worship of a supreme being. Instead, he offered a practical path to end suffering, the Noble Eightfold Path. The focus is on direct experience, meditation, ethics, and overcoming the ego. Buddhism can coexist with local beliefs, but at its core, it's a non-theistic religion. Another powerful example is Baruch Spinoza. In the 1600s, he was excommunicated from his Jewish community for holding views considered heretical. In his work Ethics, Spinoza replaces the personal God with an impersonal reality. God is nature. This God doesn't act, reward, or punish. He simply is. For Spinoza, understanding God means understanding the laws of the universe. His view of religion is a rational contemplation of natural order. No miracles, no heaven, no hell. This idea is close to what some today call atheist spirituality, a search for meaning, connection, and transcendence without invoking any supernatural beings. Some meditate, perform rituals, or find the sacred in art or nature, all without ever mentioning a god. These spiritual paths don't deny life's deep existential dimensions. In fact, they dig deeper. They show that the experience of the sacred, of mystery, of inner transformation can happen without a supreme being. They shift the focus of faith to practice, awareness, and the present moment. So maybe the question isn't just whether God exists, but whether belief in God is necessary for religion to exist. When we turn to religion, are we truly seeking a creator or something more human? Comfort, meaning, community, virtue. And you, what do you think? Does spirituality need God to exist, or can it quietly bloom in his absence? Michel Foucault never directly attacked religious texts, but his work on power and discourse raises a tough question. Could sacred scriptures, seen as divine revelations, also be tools for political control? Foucault taught that power isn't just about force, it also works through language, rules, and knowledge. That's where religious discourse becomes an interesting field of analysis. Sacred texts, the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, and others, don't just describe the world, they tell us how to live in it. They define what's right and wrong, pure and impure, allowed and forbidden. Once a text is treated as absolute truth, it starts shaping behavior, identity, and institutions. In the name of God's will, people create laws, build hierarchies, and silence others. Foucault called this a regime of truth, a system that defines what can be said, who can say it, and with what authority. In this way, sacred texts become more than just books. They're instruments of power. History proves this point. How many times have sacred texts been used to justify war, oppress women, persecute heretics, or colonize people? How often have different interpretations been erased to protect the official reading that benefits those in charge? This isn't to say that all religion is manipulation, but Foucault encourages us to ask, who gets to interpret the holy texts? Who turns divine words into civil law? Where does faith end and discipline begin? Religious authority gains strength precisely because it presents itself as something beyond the world, something sacred and untouchable. But power always shows itself in how it's used. Foucault wasn't trying to disprove God. He wanted to show how even the sacred can be used to shape behavior and maintain control. So what about you? Have you ever stopped to think about who decides what's sacred and why? Leave your thoughts in the comments and share this with anyone who believes faith should be examined, not just followed. In many religious traditions, salvation is the ultimate goal of life. Living virtuously, obeying commandments, believing in divine promises, all of it is aimed at saving the soul and earning eternal life. But existentialist thinkers ask a harder question. Is this pursuit of salvation really an act of faith, or just a more sophisticated kind of selfishness? Jean-Paul Sartre, for instance, saw religion as a way to escape the burden of freedom. In Existentialism is a humanism. He argues that we are condemned to be free, meaning there's no preset essence, no divine script. We have to create our own path. So when someone clings to the idea of salvation, it might be a way to avoid full responsibility for their life. Even worse, existentialists suggest that many so-called virtuous acts aren't really about compassion or ethics. They're about scoring points for the afterlife. Morality stops being a goal in itself and turns into a kind of spiritual bargain. Be good now, get rewarded later. In that sense, salvation becomes a spiritual business deal where good behavior is currency and paradise is the prize. Albert Camus takes this further in The Myth of Sisyphus. For him, obsessing over salvation drains life of its meaning. If everything's about what comes after, then the now becomes meaningless. Life turns into a waiting room, a test. Camus calls this philosophical suicide, abandoning reality for an invisible promise. Of course, not all faith is driven by fear or personal gain. Some people live their beliefs out of love, without expecting anything in return. But the existentialist critique forces us to ask, is your spiritual journey truly about goodness, or just about protecting yourself? And you, have you ever questioned whether your faith is about doing good, or just saving your own soul? Voltaire, a major figure of the French Enlightenment, was famous for defending freedom of thought, especially when it challenged religious authority. In a time when questioning the church could mean prison, exile, or death, Voltaire dared to say, "I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." But what happens when what you say is considered blasphemy? Blasphemy, speaking against the sacred, was long seen as one of the worst crimes. It wasn't just an offense to God, but a threat to the entire social order. Heresy, blasphemy, and rebellion often went hand in hand, because challenging dogma meant challenging the powers that enforced it, both the church and the state. Voltaire saw that kind of control as deeply authoritarian. For him, the right to blaspheme wasn't about insulting religion, it was about defending freedom of thought. Blasphemy, in this sense, is the voice of someone who refuses to bow to fear, dogma, or censorship. It's the act of saying, no idea is above criticism, not even the idea of God. That's why Voltaire supported not only freedom of religion, but also freedom from religion, from fanaticism, intolerance, inquisitions, and punishment for thinking differently. He knew that when you can't question the sacred, you can't think freely. And when you can't think freely, freedom is already dead. Throughout history, from Giordano Bruno to Salman Rushdie, blasphemy has often marked a turning point, not as cheap insult, but as a bold question aimed at what others treat as untouchable. In many cases, yesterday's blasphemer becomes today's visionary. Of course, free speech comes with responsibility. Criticism should be thoughtful, non-violent, and not just shock for shock's sake. But censorship in the name of the sacred is always dangerous. It silences not just those who speak out, but everyone who dares to think differently. So what do you believe? Is criticizing the sacred a fundamental right, or a line that should never be crossed? Democracy is often praised as the rule of the people, by the will of the people. But what happens when that will turns into imposition? What if, in the name of the majority, dissenting voices are silenced, minorities are ignored, and individual freedom is crushed? Alexis de Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill were two thinkers who saw a silent danger at the heart of democracy, the tyranny of the majority. In Democracy in America, Tocqueville looked at the US democratic experiment in the 19th century with both fascination and concern. For him, democracy didn't just risk slipping into authoritarianism. It could be authoritarian through the will of the majority. When public opinion becomes the only standard for what's right, anyone who thinks differently is seen as a threat. A new kind of despotism is born, not the tyranny of a king, but of the dominant opinion. This kind of tyranny is more subtle, but no less oppressive. The majority doesn't need to use force. It uses isolation, contempt, and ridicule. Social pressure becomes so intense that many stop thinking freely out of fear of being excluded. Ironically, democracy runs the risk of killing the very freedom it was meant to protect. John Stuart Mill, in On Liberty, took this critique even further. He argued that the only justifiable reason for society to limit an individual's freedom is to prevent harm to others. Beyond that, freedom of thought, speech, and lifestyle must be protected, even if the majority disagrees. Mill warned, "The tyranny of the majority is as dreadful as that of any one individual." Both thinkers believed in the value of democracy, but they reminded us it's not an end in itself. Majority rule is not a blank check. Individual liberty, a diversity of opinions, and respect for minorities are essential to prevent democracy from becoming exactly what it claims to oppose. So here's the question: is a society where everyone thinks the same really free? The tension between individual freedom and the collective good is one of the oldest and still most urgent debates in political philosophy. How far can, or should, an individual go in giving up personal liberty in the name of order, safety, or social harmony? Two major thinkers offer opposite answers: Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. For Hobbes, in the state of nature, that is, before the existence of any government, humans lived in constant conflict, everyone for themselves. No laws, no authority, just a brutal fight for survival. Life, as he famously said, was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Absolute freedom, in his view, led to chaos. That's why people must give up some of their liberty, transferring power to a sovereign, the Leviathan, who would ensure peace and protection. In this social contract, the collective good, understood as order and safety, justifies limiting individual freedom. And if that means obeying a strong central power, even when it imposes strict rules, so be it. For Hobbes, even the worst tyranny is better than anarchy. Rousseau, on the other hand, starts from a completely different place. In the social contract, he also believes people must unite under a common agreement. But for him, the goal isn't just to survive, it's to live well, with dignity and autonomy. Freedom for Rousseau is not something to be sacrificed, but something to be reimagined together. When people join to form the general will, they're not giving up freedom, they're reshaping it. Obeying the general will, says Rousseau, is obeying yourself. True freedom isn't doing whatever you want, it's helping create the rules you live by. It's political, active, rooted in citizenship. The contrast is clear. Hobbes sees the individual as a threat to society. Rousseau sees society as the path to real freedom. And this tension still exists today. In times of crisis, pandemics, wars, global threats, we're always forced to ask again, what are the limits of freedom? And who decides them? What about you? Is personal freedom more important, or is the common good worth the sacrifice? In his 1651 work Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes put forward a radical and lasting idea. The state is a human invention, a fiction created not because it's naturally necessary, but because it's useful. More than that, it's essential to stop humanity from destroying itself. Hobbes starts with what he calls the state of nature, a hypothetical condition where there are no laws, no government, no authority. In this world, everyone has a right to everything, which leads to endless conflict. With no common power, people live in fear and constant struggle. His famous line sums it up: Homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to man. To escape this chaos, people make a pact. They give up absolute freedom and hand over power to a sovereign, the state. But this state isn't natural or divine, it's artificial. A fictitious body, as Hobbes puts it, formed by individuals through a social contract. That's where the metaphor of the Leviathan comes in, the biblical monster that represents overwhelming power. Hobbes uses it to show that the state must be strong enough to enforce order and uphold laws. It doesn't come from morality or religion. but from fear. And it's that fear of violence, of death, of others, that justifies its existence. But since the state is a fiction, it depends on belief. It exists only as long as people believe in its usefulness. It's not eternal or sacred. It's a creation that can be reformed, criticized, or even replaced if it fails its purpose. Hobbes reminds us that authority doesn't come from the heavens. It comes from human agreement, and that changes everything. Kings rule not by divine right, but by practical need. Political legitimacy is tied to the ability to provide peace and safety. This idea still echoes today. We live in political systems that are also fictions: borders, citizenship, institutions. They work because we believe in them, and because in some way we need them. But what happens if the Leviathan stops being useful? Do we still have to obey? Leave your thoughts below, and share this with someone who's ever questioned what really holds power together. Mikhail Bakunin, one of the most influential voices in modern anarchism, made the critique of authority the core of his political thought. For him, any form of power that imposes itself from above, whether religious, political, economic, or even intellectual, should be treated with suspicion. But he went even further. It's not enough to question who rules. We must ask why anyone rules at all. Bakunin believed that authority, in general, doesn't educate. It dominates. Instead of promoting autonomy, it infantilizes. Instead of freeing people, it traps them. That's why he argued that blind obedience, even in the name of law or order, is one of the great evils of civilization. As he provocatively wrote, "If God existed, it would be necessary to abolish him." A bold way of expressing his deep distrust in any absolute or unquestionable power. But does that mean Bakunin supported chaos? Not at all. His anarchism isn't about disorder. It's about self-management, cooperation, and collective freedom. He acknowledged that some forms of authority can be useful, like a doctor who understands the human body better than the patient, or an engineer who knows how to build safely. But these forms are only legitimate if they're voluntary and based on competence, not imposed through hierarchy. To be fair and just, authority must be temporary, revisable, and built from the ground up. What Bakunin rejected was institutionalized authority, the kind that hardens into the state, the church, or economic elites. For him, the state is, by definition, a machine of coercion, built to protect the interests of a dominant minority. That's why he broke with Karl Marx. While Marx saw the state as a tool for revolution, Bakunin saw it as an obstacle. Bakunin's anarchist vision believes in people's ability to self-organize through free associations, cooperatives, councils, and horizontal communities. He believed that without coercion, individuals can develop solidarity, responsibility, and creativity. The problem was never too much freedom. It was freedom being denied. So the question lives on. Should we always obey? Or is it the act of questioning authority that truly makes us free? What do you think? Does all authority need to be earned? Or are some forms illegitimate from the start? Michel Foucault changed the way we think about power. For him, power isn't just something the state imposes from above with force or repression. It's everywhere, in our language, behaviors, knowledge, and institutions. He called this the microphysics of power, an invisible, everyday network that runs through human relationships and shapes how we act, often without us realizing it. In this sense, power rarely shows up as open violence. Instead, it becomes symbolic violence, a form of control that works through norms, expectations, and social customs. Foucault explains how we're trained from a young age to obey, to fit in, to monitor ourselves. Power shapes us long before it ever represses us. A clear example appears in his book Discipline and Punish, where he describes how society shifted from punishing the body, public torture, to disciplining the soul. Institutions like schools, prisons, hospitals, and the military became tools for normalization. They don't need to use violence. They just classify, label, examine, and measure. That alone is enough to produce obedient individuals. Power becomes more effective when it's internalized. No one needs to watch you. You learn to watch yourself. What's considered right or wrong, beautiful or ugly, healthy or acceptable, is all shaped by ideas that seem neutral but are full of hidden ideologies. Here, Foucault's concept connects with Pierre Bourdieu's idea of symbolic violence. Both show how power works quietly, by making inequality feel normal and making arbitrary rules seem natural. What's normal becomes the standard, and anyone who doesn't fit is ignored, silenced, or even labeled as sick. But Foucault didn't see power only as something negative. Power also creates, it shapes knowledge, bodies, and identities. And wherever there's power, there's resistance. Becoming aware of symbolic violence is the first step in challenging the systems that shape how we live, think, and feel. So, what about you? Have you ever stopped to ask how many of your choices are actually yours, and how many were quietly shaped by forces you didn't even notice? In Eichmann in Jerusalem, Hannah Arendt shares one of the most disturbing truths of the modern era. Evil can be banal. It doesn't always come from monsters or psychopaths. Sometimes it comes from ordinary people who simply follow orders. Adolf Eichmann, the man on trial for organizing the logistics of the Holocaust, wasn't a raging sadist. He was a disciplined employee, efficient, obedient, and proud of his work. His defense? I was just following orders. To Arendt, this was even scarier than active cruelty. It was blind obedience. Arendt believed Eichmann didn't think. He didn't reflect on the consequences of his actions. His obedience protected him from moral responsibility. This is what she meant by the banality of evil. Evil committed not out of hatred, but from a failure to think. When obedience becomes automatic, it creates space for the worst crimes. This flips the usual story, where rebels are the dangerous ones. Arendt asks us to consider the opposite. What if the real threat isn't rebellion, but obedience? What if the biggest moral danger is not breaking the rules, but following them without question? Throughout history, major state crimes, genocide, dictatorships, persecution were only possible because millions obeyed. Systems work only when people accept the roles they're given, even if those roles go against basic ethics. That's why Arendt forces us to reflect. Obedience may be comfortable, but at what cost? This doesn't mean all authority is bad. Arendt wasn't an anarchist, but she believed obedience is only valid when guided by ethical judgment, when we think about what and why we obey. Rebellion, on the other hand, involves risk and conflict, but also critical thought and courage. The rebel asks questions. The obedient one stays silent. The question remains, in a world of systems, institutions, and rules, how willing are we to think for ourselves? And you? Have you ever obeyed out of fear of questioning, or stood up for something, even when it cost you? To many people, capitalism means freedom, progress, and innovation. But to Karl Marx, it was, above all, a system of exploitation. A world where a few accumulate wealth while the majority work just to survive. For Marx, the problem with capitalism isn't only economic, it's ethical. It normalizes inequality, turns human relationships into market transactions, and makes profit the highest value. In Capital, Marx breaks down how accumulation works. He shows that capital doesn't grow magically. It feeds on the time, labor, and lives of workers. Profit comes from surplus value, the extra that a worker produces beyond what they're paid. That's not just unfair, it's morally unjustifiable. A system built on constant exploitation, Marx argued, cannot lead to real freedom. But the critique doesn't end there. Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek updates Marx's ideas for the modern world. He argues that capitalism didn't weaken, it evolved. It became more effective by learning how to absorb criticism. Today, it sells rebellion, diversity, and social causes. all with a price tag. Zizek points out that we live in an age where capitalism appears ethical. We buy eco-friendly products, support conscious brands, donate small change at the checkout, and feel like we've done our part. But deep down, the logic stays the same. Profit above all. Charity replaces justice. The appearance of kindness hides the system's core structure. Both Marx and Zizek ask the same question. Can a system built on structural inequality, total commodification, and endless accumulation be morally justified? It's not enough to talk about tech progress or economic growth. The real question is, at what cost? Of course, this isn't about romanticizing systems that also failed. It's about keeping the critical question alive. Are we living in a system that promotes dignity or just efficiency? And you? Do you believe capitalism is the best system we've got, or just the best disguised one? Few phrases have caused more outrage in the history of political philosophy than this one. Property is theft. It was written by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a 19th century French thinker considered the father of modern anarchism. But what exactly did he mean? Theft from whom and why? To understand his point, you have to look beyond the shock value. Proudhon wasn't attacking personal possessions, the bread you eat, the house you live in, the clothes you wear. He made a distinction. That's possession, and he defended it. What he opposed was private ownership of the means of production, land, factories, resources, concentrated in the hands of a few and used to exploit the labor of others. Proudhon's critique may be radical, but it's also clear. When someone owns land, for example, and prevents others from using it, even if they're not cultivating it, they're not just possessing, they're depriving others. In that sense, property isn't neutral. It creates inequality. It's the legal right to exclude others from access to things essential to life. And there's more. When a property owner hires workers to produce goods and services, they appropriate the value created by those workers, paying just enough to keep them going, while pocketing the surplus as profit. For Proudhon, this was legalized exploitation. That's why he said, private property doesn't protect, it steals. But be careful. He wasn't calling for chaos or the end of all property. His vision was of a society built on self-management and collective ownership of production. No bosses and employees, but associations of workers. No centralized state, but free federations. His model wasn't authoritarian communism. It was mutualism, cooperation without domination. And his critique still resonates. In a world where a small minority owns vast amounts of land, wealth, and power, while billions struggle for the basics, Proudhon's question hits hard. Who really creates value, and who really profits? Does private property, as it's structured today, protect freedom for all, or just the privilege of a few? What do you think? Is private accumulation a sacred right, or a barrier to social justice? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and share this video with anyone who believes that asking the right questions is the first step to meaningful change. The right to vote is often seen as the ultimate symbol of democratic freedom. Voting means having a voice, making choices, shaping the future of a country, or at least that's the idea. But for Noam Chomsky, one of the fiercest critics of modern Western politics, this belief is often a carefully crafted illusion. Universal suffrage may exist, but that doesn't mean the people are truly in charge. In his books and interviews, Chomsky argues that modern liberal democracies run under the appearance of public participation, while real power remains in the hands of economic and corporate elites. He once said, "Elections are like a distraction. While people argue over parties, the structural interests of capital stay untouched." His critique goes beyond party politics. According to Chomsky, the system is designed to limit the actual impact of the people's will. Even when voting is free, citizens are subjected to heavy ideological manipulation through the media, advertising, and scripted political discourse. The voter isn't choosing freely, they're picking from options that were pre-shaped by the interests of those in power. This is what he calls the manufacturing of consent, a key phrase in his work. Mass media, instead of informing, often acts as an ideological filter, promoting a worldview that favors the status quo. In this context, voting becomes symbolic, a ritual that legitimizes a system that rarely changes. But does this mean voting is pointless? Not quite. Chomsky isn't calling for the end of democracy, but for its deepening. He warns us not to confuse democratic appearances with real democratic substance. True people power, in his view, only exists when there is grassroots organizing, critical education, and independence from big economic interests. That leads to an uncomfortable question. Is voting every 4 years, picking from candidates shaped by the system, really an act of power, or just a modern, efficient way to keep the masses under control? What do you think? Is voting a real tool for change, or just a way to keep a rigged game going? For Jacques Derrida, justice is not the same as law, and it's in that gap between the two where one of the greatest paradoxes of modernity lies. The very laws meant to guarantee justice can also become tools of oppression. In his work, Force of Law, the mystical foundation of authority, Derrida questions the origin of positive law, the formal legal systems we live under. He claims that every legal order is born from a founding moment that isn't rational or fully explainable. It's almost mythical. The authority of law rests on an initial decision that ultimately escapes logic, the foundational moment where power legitimizes itself. This mystical foundation means that even though laws are applied rationally, their origin is beyond reason. And that's dangerous, because what appears to be neutral, logical, and universal, legal codes, may actually carry the biases, interests, and exclusions of the group that created them. Law, in this view, acts impartial, but operates with hidden partiality. Behind its formal mask, it may conceal symbolic violence. Derrida goes even further. He says true justice is ungraspable. Law is structured, written, measurable. Justice is not. Justice is overwhelming, unpredictable, always to come. When we apply the law, we say we're pursuing justice, but in reality, we're just repeating a pre-existing structure. In this way, law can actually suppress the desire for justice by pretending it already delivers it. Here lies the subtle form of oppression. When we follow the law without questioning where it came from, what it's really doing, or who it truly serves, when legal language becomes dogma, it shuts down dissent, ignores uniqueness, and erases exceptions. Derrida warns that law can be a system of exclusion disguised as order. This doesn't mean we should throw out all laws, but it does mean we should face them with critical awareness. Legality isn't the same as legitimacy, and not everything that's legal is just. So ask yourself, have you ever wondered if what's being called justice is really just a polished form of control? Albert Camus opens The Myth of Sisyphus with a striking claim. There is only one really serious philosophical question: suicide. Not as a psychological act, but as a logical issue. If life has no objective meaning, no purpose given by God, nature, or reason, then is it still worth living? For Camus, human beings crave meaning, but the universe is indifferent. It doesn't answer. Death is certain. Suffering is unavoidable, and the great religious and philosophical stories that once offered ultimate meaning are collapsing in the modern world. What's left is what Camus calls the absurd, the clash between our desire for meaning and the world's silence. Camus doesn't say life is absurd in itself, but that it becomes absurd when we search for a meaning it can't give us. The absurd isn't out there, it's born in the relationship between us and the world. We ask questions the universe doesn't answer, and that silence, that void, is for Camus the core of the modern condition. In response, Camus identifies 3 classic options: physical suicide, philosophical suicide, escaping into blind faith or metaphysical hope, or what he sees as the only truly conscious path: living the absurd, accepting it without apathy, facing it without illusions, not denying the void, but using it as a starting point for an authentic life. Enter Sisyphus, the mythological figure condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. To any rational mind, his task is pointless, repetitive, and meaningless. But Camus invites us to imagine Sisyphus not as defeated, but as someone who claims his freedom in the face of the absurd. He knows his task has no end. And yet, he keeps going. That's tragic. But it's also heroic. That's why Camus says, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why? Because by accepting the absurd, he frees himself from needing a pre-made meaning. He lives without hope, but with clarity. And that clarity, the awareness of the absurd, opens the door to creating your own meaning, even if it's imperfect or temporary. So, if life has no objective meaning, Camus doesn't see that as a death sentence. He sees it as a call to freedom. Without a cosmic manual, we are responsible for shaping our own path. Ethics, then, isn't imposed from outside. It's built through responsibility and courage. Ultimately, Camus doesn't invite us to despair. He calls us to existential rebellion, to live despite the lack of meaning, to love, create, fight, and think. Even with no guarantees, even knowing it all ends. Not to escape the absurd, but to face it head-on, like Sisyphus with his rock. And you? Have you ever asked yourself if life's meaning needs to come from outside? Or if it can be created, right here, right now, by you? In the myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus boldly states, to decide whether life is worth living is to answer the fundamental question of philosophy. Before we ask about God, morality, or politics, there's a more radical question: should we keep living or not? For Camus, suicide is the first and most urgent philosophical issue, not for emotional or religious reasons, but as a logical question. He doesn't ask if suicide is morally wrong. He asks if it's a rational response to a meaningless world, in a universe without objective meaning, where everything seems temporary, unstable, and destined to die. Why go on? For Camus, the absurd is born from a collision. On one side, we humans crave order, clarity, and meaning. On the other, the universe is silent, chaotic, indifferent. That tension between our hunger for meaning and the world's indifference creates the absurd. And for some, it feels unbearable. At this point, Camus confronts suicide as a potential solution. If life is absurd, if there's no final reason to live, then suicide might seem like a clean answer. But here, Camus takes an unexpected turn. He rejects suicide as a solution, not out of moralism or faith, but because, to him, suicide avoids the problem instead of facing it. Ending your life breaks the confrontation with the absurd. It sidesteps the struggle. But for Camus, the real challenge is to stay conscious of the absurd and still live. To live is to revolt. This revolt doesn't mean resignation. It's a kind of tragic freedom, accepting that life has no built-in meaning and choosing to live it fully anyway. Suicide, in this view, is a form of surrender, a refusal to carry the burden of awareness. Camus says there's no honor in escaping the void. There's greatness in living within it, lucidly. He does acknowledge the real pain that drives some people to suicide. His critique isn't of those who suffer, but of the illusion that suicide solves the problem of meaning. The answer he offers isn't denial, it's tragic affirmation. Just like Sisyphus pushes his rock forever, humans must keep living, even without knowing why. There's a kind of existential heroism in that. To love, create, and resist, even when nothing's guaranteed, is the highest form of freedom. Not because life has a secret meaning, but because we can invent one. Camus writes, "There is no fate that cannot be overcome by scorn," and that scorn, oddly enough, is a form of love for life. A lucid love, without illusions or dogma, but full of courage. And you? Do you think suicide is a rational response to the absurd, or an escape from the challenge of living without guarantees? The idea that human life has absolute inherent value, what we call intrinsic value, has long been a core belief in Western ethics. But today, that idea is being questioned in some of the most difficult bioethical debates we face. When we talk about abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide, end-of-life rights, genetic manipulation, artificial intelligence, and even the moral status of embryos, the question is always the same. Does human life have value just because it exists? Or does that value depend on certain conditions, like consciousness, autonomy, or dignity? From a deontological perspective, like Immanuel Kant's, human life has dignity and should never be treated as a means to an end. Humans, Kant says, are ends in themselves. That means life should be respected, regardless of utility, suffering, or development. This idea supports many arguments against euthanasia or abortion, for example. Life has value simply because it's human, but modern bioethicists are no longer so sure. Philosophers like Peter Singer argue that moral value can't be based on species alone. For Singer, what matters is the ability to suffer, to have interests, to be aware. He says a newborn with no future consciousness might have less moral value than an adult animal that feels pain. This challenges the traditional view. Not all human life would have equal moral weight. That leads to what some call a quality of life ethic. It asks not just if someone is alive, but how they're living. Take someone in a permanent vegetative state. Do they still have intrinsic value? Or would it be more ethical to let them go? Some question our growing rejection of speciesism. Why should human life be seen as more valuable than other sentient life? Biotech raises even more questions. With gene editing and AI evolving, what does human life even mean today? And what will it mean tomorrow? Of course, this flexibility comes with risks. If life's value becomes conditional, who gets to set the rules? History warns us this path can lead to abuse, eugenics, and marginalization. That's why many still defend the idea of intrinsic value as a moral safeguard against using life as a means to an end. But holding onto that idea too rigidly also has consequences. It can stop someone from dying with dignity. It can prolong suffering in the name of an abstract principle. It can deny people the autonomy to choose how their life ends. At its core, contemporary bioethics forces us to face an uncomfortable question. Is the value of human life an eternal truth, or a moral, historical, and political idea that needs rethinking? And you? Do you believe life has value just because it exists? Or does that value depend on quality, consciousness, and suffering? Few 20th century philosophers explored death as deeply as Martin Heidegger. In his masterpiece, Being and Time, he doesn't treat death as just a biological event or social taboo, but as a defining existential experience. For Heidegger, death isn't just the end of life, it's what reveals our most personal potential for being. He doesn't ask if death is real, he asks how it shapes us as human beings. And here, he flips the usual perspective. We don't just live until we die, we live in the light of death. Humans are the only beings that know they will die, and that awareness changes everything. Heidegger calls this being toward death, Sein zum Tod. Death is the one absolute certainty, and also the most radical possibility. It's non-transferable. No one can die in our place, and it's unavoidable. We can't escape it. But paradoxically, it's this very certainty that can wake us up to a more authentic life. In daily life, Heidegger says, we get lost in routine, distraction, and what he calls the impersonal they. They do this, they think that. You're supposed to live this way. In this inauthentic mode of being, we avoid thinking about death, but in doing so, we also avoid thinking about ourselves. It's when we confront death, whether through loss or personal awareness, that existence becomes raw and honest. Death tears away the mask of normality and forces us to ask, what am I doing with my life? Am I living like someone who knows time is limited? or just drifting through life on autopilot? For Heidegger, authenticity comes when we face our finiteness seriously. Being toward death isn't morbid or dark. It's about clarity, urgency, and real presence. Death isn't just an end. It's a call, a reminder that every choice matters, that time isn't endless. In that sense, death can be seen as a kind of liberation, not in a religious sense of reaching the afterlife, but in an existential sense of breaking free from illusions, distractions, and external expectations. In the face of death, the superficial fades away. What's essential remains. Heidegger doesn't ask what comes after. That's not his concern. What matters is how death transforms the way we exist right now. It calls us to live with individuality, courage, and presence, precisely because it all ends. So, death isn't just the end of life. It can also be the beginning of fully experiencing life. And you? Do you see death as the final stop, or as a portal to a more authentic, meaningful way of living? Few philosophers in the 20th century explored the question of death as deeply as Martin Heidegger. In his masterpiece, Being and Time, he doesn't treat death as a biological event or a social taboo, but as a decisive existential experience. For Heidegger, death is not just the end of life. It reveals the deepest possibility of being. The question he raises is not whether death exists, but how it shapes us as human beings. And here's where he flips common sense. We don't just live until we die. We live in the light of death. We are the only creatures who know we are going to die, and that awareness changes everything. Heidegger calls this being toward death, Sein zum Tode. Death is the only absolute certainty, and at the same time, our most radical possibility. It's non-transferable. No one can die in our place, and it's inevitable. There's no escaping it. But paradoxically, it's precisely this awareness of finitude that can awaken us to authentic life. In daily life, according to Heidegger, we live caught up in routine, distraction, and what he calls the impersonal they, as in, they say this, people do that. This is how one lives. In this inauthentic way of being, we avoid thinking about death. But by doing so, we also avoid thinking about ourselves. It's when we confront death, whether through the loss of someone or through the sense of our own mortality, that existence is stripped bare. Death tears away the veil of normality and forces us to ask, what am I doing with my life? Am I living like someone who knows time is limited, or just existing on autopilot? For Heidegger, authenticity begins when we take this finitude seriously. Living as a being toward death doesn't mean being morbid or pessimistic. It means living with clarity, urgency, and full presence. Death, then, isn't just an ending. It's a call, a constant reminder that every choice matters, every moment counts, and time is not infinite. In that sense, death can also be seen as a kind of liberation, not in the religious sense of reaching an afterlife, but in the existential sense of freeing us from illusions, distractions, and other people's expectations. Faced with death, the superficial loses its weight. What remains is what's essential. Heidegger doesn't answer whether there is something after. That's not his concern. What matters to him is how the awareness of death transforms the way we live now. Death calls us to singularity, to the courage of being ourselves. Even if, and perhaps because, everything will one day end. So, death is not just the conclusion of life. It can be the beginning of full awareness of our existence. What about you? Do you see death as the final end, or as a doorway to a more authentic, more meaningful life? Man is condemned to be free. This statement by Jean-Paul Sartre is one of the most unsettling in existentialist philosophy. For him, human beings are not born with a fixed nature, a defined purpose, or a set destiny. On the contrary, we exist first, and only later define ourselves through our actions. This is the core of existentialism. Existence precedes essence. But what does that really mean? In most religious and philosophical traditions, it was believed that everything, including human beings, had an essence, a fixed nature, a role, a meaning established by God, reason, or the order of the universe. Just like a knife is made with the essence of cutting, humans were thought to be born to be something: good, just, obedient, rational, and so on. Sartre breaks with that logic. He argues that humans have no pre-given essence. There is no template for humanity that comes before us. We are born, and only afterward, through our choices and actions, do we become something. We're not good or bad by nature. We are what we make of ourselves. This radical freedom, however, comes with equally radical responsibility. Without a universal manual, we can no longer hide behind excuses, not biological, not cultural, not religious. Every choice we make expresses a vision of what we believe humans should be. Sartre writes, "In choosing for myself, I choose for everyone." This doesn't mean forcing our choices on others, but recognizing that every action is also an ethical statement. And that's heavy. That's frightening. That's why he says we are condemned to be free, because we can't escape it. Even not choosing is a choice. Even silence says something. That's why existentialism is not a do whatever you want philosophy. Quite the opposite. If there's no pre-given essence, then everything depends on us. And that requires constant ethical commitment. We are the authors of our existence, but not in the comfort of fantasy, in the risk of reality. Freedom, in Sartre, comes hand in hand with anxiety, because knowing we are solely responsible for ourselves is both liberating and terrifying. Sartre invites us then to live authentically, to own our actions, desires, mistakes, and goals without shifting blame, without outsourcing our life's meaning to institutions, dogmas, or traditions. Authentic existence isn't easy. It's a constant challenge to become what we're not yet. But if we are free to invent who we are, then life, even without a given essence, is not empty. It's full of possibility. And maybe that's the great existentialist paradox. There's no ready-made meaning, but that's not a reason for despair. It's a call to create. And you? Are you living as if your essence is already defined, or as someone who knows that everything you are depends on the choices you make? Among the most disturbing and controversial philosophical ideas today, antinatalism holds a unique place. Its central claim is simple and radical. Bringing someone into the world is, in itself, a morally problematic act. One of its main proponents is South African philosopher David Benatar, author of Better Never to Have Been. For Benatar, human life is inevitably tied to suffering. No matter how good someone's life might seem, being born is the gateway to illness, frustration, loss, physical pain, existential dread, and eventually, death. And even if there are moments of joy or accomplishment, they never fully outweigh the burden of pain. Benatar builds his argument on what he calls a moral asymmetry. His reasoning goes like this: the presence of pain is bad. The presence of pleasure is good. The absence of pain, for someone who was never born, is good, even if there's no one there to enjoy it. But the absence of pleasure, for someone who was never born, is not bad, because there's no one being deprived of it. In other words, not being born avoids harm, suffering, and doesn't cause harm, missing out on pleasure. Therefore, bringing someone into existence is always, potentially, an imposition of suffering without their consent. This idea clashes head-on with traditional views of life. Most religions, cultures, and philosophies treat life as a gift, a miracle, or at least an opportunity. Antinatalism flips that logic. It's not death that's the problem, it's birth. But Benatar is not suggesting people should end their own lives. He doesn't promote suicide. His proposal is ethical, not destructive. We should stop creating new lives to avoid perpetuating an inevitable cycle of suffering. In other words, antinatalism is less about personal death and more about intergenerational responsibility. Critics call antinatalism nihilistic, bleak, and out of touch. After all, many people find meaning, love, beauty, creativity, and joy in life. Doesn't this ignore humanity's capacity for resilience and transcendence? Benatar responds that yes, those moments exist, but they're rare and don't outweigh the deep suffering experienced by billions: poverty, violence, mental illness, abandonment, grief, failure. For him, it's a naively optimistic illusion to believe life is, as a rule, worth it. The core question, then, is philosophical and ethical. Do we have the right to create a life that will definitely suffer, even if it might also experience joy? Antinatalism forces us to face life head-on, without sugarcoating, without myths. It challenges us to think not just about our desire to have children, but about what it means to bring someone into a world where suffering is guaranteed and happiness is uncertain. And you? Do you believe life is a gift, or that the greatest act of compassion might be not to create a life destined to endure pain? For many people, hope is what keeps us going, an invisible thread pulling us forward, even when everything seems to fall apart. But for Émile Cioran, one of the most darkly brilliant philosophers of the 20th century, hope isn't a virtue. It's a dangerous addiction, a self-deception that prolongs suffering and feeds the illusion that everything will make sense in the end. In his book, A Short History of Decay, Cioran writes with the intensity of someone who has stared into the abyss and chosen to stay there. For him, hope is a refined form of metaphysical cowardice, a refusal to face reality as it is, without purpose, without redemption, without a happy ending. To hope is to delay collapse. It's clinging to a comforting lie. Unlike the cold, rational nihilism of some thinkers, Cioran develops a poetic, almost lyrical form of nihilism. His writing, filled with aphorisms, is less a system than an existential outpouring. He doesn't aim to prove life is meaningless. He feels that void intensely and turns it into literature. That's what makes his philosophy so unsettling. It doesn't argue. It bleeds. To Cioran, hope is a leftover from theology that survives even in secular times. Even those who no longer believe in God keep hoping. For justice, for love, for change, for healing, for peace. Hope, in this sense, is the last mask of optimism. The final attempt to save a world that no longer holds. It's an addiction because it's so hard to let go of, even when there's no reason left to keep hoping. But Cioran wasn't preaching death. He himself admitted, "Life fascinates me as much as it wounds me." His nihilism didn't lead him to suicide, which he saw as a kind of premature ending to the tragedy. Instead, he proposed a kind of aesthetic survival, living without meaning, but with clarity, without hope, but with irony, without faith, but with style. By abandoning hope, Cioran believed something is freed. The weight of expectation lifts. Tomorrow stops being an obsession. And paradoxically, life becomes lighter, freer, even more bearable. Clarity in the face of the absurd doesn't create despair. It invites silence, contemplation, and sometimes even a bitter laugh. In a world that constantly pushes us to believe everything will work out, Cioran asks, what if it doesn't? What if humanity's greatest mistake was never accepting failure as fate? What if hoping is a way of denying ourselves? Cioran's critique isn't a moral condemnation of hope. It's an invitation to lucid hopelessness, a state where nothing is promised, but everything is given, simply by being here, breathing, observing the void, and maybe, just maybe, turning it into poetry. And you? Do you think hope is a strength? Or a golden prison? Do you live because you still believe, or despite no longer believing at all? Immortality is, for many, humanity's oldest dream. From myths of eternal youth to religious promises of life after death, And now, with transhumanist goals and life-extending technologies, the idea of living forever sounds, at first, irresistible. But British philosopher Bernard Williams asks us to take a closer look at this desire, and maybe the more important question isn't, is it possible to live forever? But would it even be worth it? In his classic essay, The Macropolis Case, Reflections on the Tedium of Immortality, Williams explores a Czech play where a woman lives for 300 years after drinking an elixir of eternal life, and over time falls into deep boredom, eventually begging for death. From that story, Williams builds a striking philosophical argument. Immortality, far from being desirable, would actually become unbearable. Why? Because according to Williams, our identity is deeply tied to our goals, desires, and limitations. We are finite beings. And it's exactly that finiteness that gives weight to our choices. Having limited time forces us to prioritize, to search for meaning, to act with urgency. Paradoxically, death is what gives shape to life. If we were immortal, Williams says, the projects that drive us today would eventually lose their meaning. The repetition of experiences would wear out desire. Love, art, discovery, all of it would become dull. Boredom would set in, not as a passing emotion, but as a permanent condition. Our very capacity to want would collapse. Living forever would stop being living and become just enduring. There's also another question. Would we even remain ourselves after centuries or millennia? Or would we become strangers to who we once were, buried under layers and layers of experience that dissolve any clear sense of identity? Williams argues that preserving personal continuity over eternity is not just unlikely, it might not even be desirable. His conclusion is bold. While death is painful and feared, it's also a necessary part of the human condition. It gives structure to existence. To wish for immortality is, in some way, to wish to stop being human. Of course, this doesn't erase the pain of loss or the desire to live longer, but it offers an important limit. Living a long life can be great. Living forever, maybe not. The fear of death shouldn't make us idealize its absolute opposite. The real question isn't, how can we live forever? But how can we live well with the time we have? And you? Do you think living forever would be a gift or a prison? Leave your thoughts in the comments and share with someone who's ever wondered if the end of life is what actually makes it so precious. Few things fascinate us more than love. It drives stories, wars, works of art, sacrifices, and dreams. Western culture has turned it into an ideal, a pure, transcendent feeling that gives meaning to life. But Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis casts an uncomfortable shadow over that image. What if love, at its core, is just the civilized mask of a biological impulse? Far from denying love's power, Freud tries to uncover it. For him, what we call love is largely a sublimation of sexual desire, or more specifically, libido. In works like 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality, Freud argues that human beings are driven by unconscious forces, with sexuality at the center. Romantic love, with all its poetic and idealized flair, is a socially acceptable way to express these impulses. In this sense, love isn't a spiritual elevation, but a tension between instinct and culture. Civilization demands we repress our primitive desires to maintain order. And it's that very repression that leads to idealization. Instead of openly desiring, we turn the object of our desire into pure love. We adore, we put the other on a pedestal. We craft symbolic narratives that beautify what is, at its core, still desire. Freud also saw love as a troubling paradox. We crave fusion with another person, yet fear losing ourselves. We love intensely, but that same passion can turn into jealousy, guilt, hatred, or fear of abandonment. So love isn't just a source of joy. It's also a breeding ground for psychological suffering. What Freud does, with brutal honesty, is dismantle romantic love as a cultural construct. There are no soulmates, no guaranteed forever. There are drives, projections, unresolved childhood traumas, unconscious patterns. We often love not for who the other person truly is, but for what they represent to our psyche. But that doesn't mean love is fake. It means it's complex, messy, and deeply human. Freud invites us to let go of the illusion of purity and face love as it really is. A battlefield of desire, ideals, fear, and need. To love, in this sense, isn't about finding your other half. It's about learning to deal with the contradictions within yourself and the other person. His diagnosis is uncomfortable, but freeing. By pulling love off its romantic pedestal, Freud gives it back to us as a human experience. Not as a fairy tale, but as a call to emotional maturity. To love isn't to live a fantasy. It's learning to live with lack, with imperfection, with incompleteness. To coexist with desire without letting it destroy what we build. At its core, Freud shows us that love doesn't need to be sacred to be real. It might be biological, but that doesn't make it less meaningful. Maybe by accepting that love is also instinct, longing, fear, and projection, we become better equipped to live it truthfully, instead of chasing ideals that only bring disappointment. And you? Do you believe love is just chemistry, or something that transcends instinct? In our culture, we often treat truth as something pure, neutral, and universal. We believe that by searching for truth, we're getting closer to something out there, just waiting to be discovered. But Michel Foucault flips that idea on its head. In his work, The Order of Discourse, he offers a deeply unsettling view. Truth isn't discovered, it's produced. And more than that, it's always connected to power. For Foucault, discourse, meaning what can be said, thought, and accepted as valid, is never truly free. It's shaped by power structures that define what counts as true in a specific time or society. There is no such thing as pure truth floating above history. What we have are regimes of truth that shift depending on institutions, interests, and systems of power. He writes, "Truth is of this world. It is produced by multiple constraints and produces regulatory effects of power." In other words, truth doesn't exist apart from power. It's a product of it, and every form of power works to produce and maintain a version of truth that legitimizes its rule. Look at medicine, law, psychology, education. They all decide what's normal, acceptable, or rational. But who sets those standards? Who defines what's a mental illness, what counts as a crime, or what's considered intelligence? These definitions come from institutions, universities, courts, schools, hospitals that hold social authority. And that authority isn't neutral. It shapes behavior, excludes what doesn't fit, and silences anything that threatens it. Foucault isn't saying everything is a lie, or that reality doesn't exist. He's not a relativist in the simple sense. What he's showing is that what we call truth always goes through political, historical, and social filters. So, we should ask, who's speaking? From where? With what kind of power? This idea is especially powerful in a world full of competing narratives. Foucault teaches us that the struggle for power is also a struggle over discourse, over who gets to define what is true. Controlling language means shaping social reality, not always out of bad faith, but because every discourse reflects a worldview, and every worldview leaves things out. So truth isn't just a neutral endpoint, it's a battlefield. For Foucault, to think critically is to denaturalize discourse, to question what seems obvious, to listen to the silenced, and to expose the hidden structures behind what's called natural. He leaves us with an urgent question. Is the truth we believe in a path to reality, or a subtle construction of power that controls who gets to speak and who must stay silent? What about you? Have you ever stopped to ask who decided the truth you believe in? There are no facts, only interpretations. This quote by Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the most misunderstood and one of the most provocative in the history of philosophy. Far from promoting cheap relativism or denying reality, It's a direct challenge to our belief in absolutes, objective truth, and so-called universal certainties. Nietzsche didn't deny that reality exists. What he questioned was the idea that we can access it in a pure, unfiltered way. For him, all knowledge of the world goes through interpretation, a human lens that gives things meaning, organizes chaos, and builds systems like morality, science, and religion that feel natural, but are really constructed. In this sense, truth is a useful fiction. In his essay on Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, Nietzsche says truth is a mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms, enhanced, transferred, and embellished. Language doesn't reveal reality, it creates it. So when Nietzsche says there are no facts, he's criticizing the Enlightenment idea that human reason can discover neutral, final truth. Every truth, he argues, carries a perspective, a purpose, and a will to power. There is no observation without bias. Every claim is a position, not a mirror of the real. This idea can sound dangerous. If everything is interpretation, how do we tell truth from lies? How do we avoid total chaos? But Nietzsche doesn't want us to give up on meaning. He wants us to own the meanings we create. He urges us to pursue knowledge with philosophical honesty, recognizing that all truth is contextual, temporary, and fragile. There's no God's eye view of reality. There are only human perspectives, varied, conflicting, and ever-changing. That's why Nietzsche offers a tragic philosophy, living without absolute certainty, but also without apathy, creating values, interpreting the world, building meaning, knowing it's all temporary, but still worth living for. This view stands firmly against dogma, fanaticism, and moral rigidity. It tells us to question eternal truths declared by religion, politics, and ideology. Every truth has a body, and every body carries interests. Nietzsche wants to free us from the conceptual prisons we've inherited. He's not saying everything goes, but calling us to recognize that meaning is interpretive, and that freedom of thought comes from accepting this. So, are you ready to question the truths you always believed and see the world not as something given, but as something constantly being made? In today's world, science holds a nearly sacred status. Its methods are seen as the only valid path to truth. For many, it's the universal language of reason, the final authority on reality. But philosopher Paul Feyerabend, one of the most rebellious thinkers of the 20th century, asked a difficult question. What if science isn't as neutral and objective as it seems? What if it's just one story among many? In his controversial book Against Method, Feyerabend introduced what he called epistemological anarchism. He argued that there is no single, rigid, infallible, scientific method. Science, throughout history, hasn't progressed by following fixed rules. In fact, breakthroughs often happened when scientists broke the rules of their time. He wrote, "The only principle that does not inhibit progress is anything goes." This wasn't a call for chaos, but a critique of how science had become rigid and dogmatic. Feyerabend didn't deny that science works. He questioned its claim to be the only legitimate form of knowledge. He believed that philosophy, art, indigenous traditions, and even religious myths also offer valid ways of understanding the world. To him, science had become an ideology. It claims to be neutral, but it's backed by institutions, funding, political interests, and structures of power. It decides what counts as real, what's rational, and what's just superstition. As a result, scientific discourse, even unintentionally, excludes, silences, and dominates other worldviews. Feyerabend argued that we should treat science as one cultural narrative among many. That doesn't mean science isn't valuable. It just means its value depends on context. For example, indigenous cosmology might not meet modern physics standards, but that doesn't make it inferior as a symbolic or meaningful way of life. This view is deeply uncomfortable for those who see science as the last bastion of reason. But Feyerabend wanted to challenge the worship of science, not to destroy it, but to free it from the rigid mindset that limits its creativity. He wanted a more open, diverse, and plural science that's in conversation with other ways of knowing. Of course, his ideas were controversial. Critics said epistemological anarchism made room for pseudoscience and denialism. But Feyerabend warned that the real danger lies in monopolizing truth. Whenever one worldview becomes absolute, whether scientific or religious, freedom of thought is at risk. At its core, his message is ethical, radical intellectual freedom. Questioning science doesn't mean rejecting it. It means treating it with the same critical eye it applies to the world. Do you believe science is a neutral form of knowledge, or a powerful story that also needs to be questioned? When we talk about reality, we usually think of it as something solid and objective, something that exists independently of us. But what if that's not entirely true? What if what we call real is mostly built by the language we use to name, describe, and understand it? That question lies at the heart of one of the most important debates in modern philosophy. For thinkers like Ludwig Wittgenstein and Jacques Derrida, language isn't just a tool for describing the world, it shapes the world we experience. Let's start with Wittgenstein, especially in his later work, Philosophical Investigations. He moves away from the idea that language mirrors reality and introduces the idea of language games. Every human community plays its own games with language, and the rules of these games shape what can be said, thought, and understood. In other words, there's no universal language above human experience. Language is a social practice, and meaning depends on use. For Wittgenstein, meanings aren't hidden inside words like labels. They come from how we use words in real-life situations. And if meaning comes from use, then the reality we experience through language is also shaped by how we use it. Then comes Derrida, who takes this even further. In works like Of Grammatology and Writing and Difference, he famously wrote that there is nothing outside the text. That doesn't mean nothing exists. It means we don't access reality without language. Everything we understand is already shaped by signs, structures, and discourse. The world doesn't speak directly to us. We interpret it through language. Derrida shows that words never have fixed meanings. Their meaning is always deferred, a constant process of difference, which he called difference. That means language has no stable center. And if language structures how we access reality, then reality itself isn't stable. It's fluid, moving, constructed. This gave rise to ideas like linguistic constructivism, the idea that our social world is built through the narratives we create. Gender, identity, nationhood, authority, even ideas like normal or truth aren't natural facts, but historical constructs shaped by language. Does this mean reality isn't real? Not exactly. The point is that the way we perceive, organize, and give meaning to the world depends on the linguistic and symbolic systems we use, and that has serious implications. Changing language often means changing the world. Take social movements. When oppressed groups reclaim their names, when they reject imposed labels and create new ones, they're not just swapping words. They're reshaping how they exist in the world. Language isn't just description, it's political action and symbolic power. So the question isn't just whether language creates reality, but what kinds of realities are possible or impossible depending on the language we have. Have you ever wondered how many of your deepest truths are actually inherited words you never chose? Share your thoughts and pass this on to someone who wants to understand how words shape the very world we believe we live in. We live in a culture that teaches us to trust knowledge as something neutral, objective, and fair. Science, schools, the media all present themselves as messengers of truth. But what if what we call knowledge is, in many ways, a way to maintain the status quo? What if knowledge is also an instrument of ideological power? That's exactly what Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser argues in his theory of ideological state apparatuses, ISAs. In his essay Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Althusser claims that the state doesn't maintain itself only through repression, meaning police, military, laws, but also through the production of ideas. Ideas that make domination seem natural, fair, even desirable. These ideas are transmitted through institutions like schools, families, media, churches, the legal system, and even art and culture. These are the essays, mechanisms that subtly and continuously reproduce the dominant ideology. They don't force, they educate, shape, and normalize the world as it is. Althusser urges us to recognize that there is no such thing as knowledge outside of ideology. Every kind of knowledge is situated, built within a specific historical context, and shaped by the interests of the social structures that produce it. This doesn't mean all knowledge is false. It means it's always entangled with power. Take schools, for example. They're often seen as neutral spaces for learning. But Althusser shows that schools are the most effective ISA in modern society. They teach us to obey schedules, accept hierarchies, compete, submit to authority, all under the banner of meritocracy. School curriculums aren't innocent. They decide what should be remembered, what should be forgotten, and what's considered important. So knowledge becomes part of an ideological battle. When science claims to be apolitical, it's often just reproducing dominant ideologies under the disguise of neutrality. When a history book leaves out certain events or highlights others, it's not just sharing facts, it's shaping a narrative. But there's something even deeper. Ideology doesn't just act from the outside. Althusser says it forms us. In other words, we're shaped by ideology without even realizing it. It calls to us, molds us, shapes who we are, and the knowledge we consume, internalize, and reproduce plays a role in that formation. The solution, for Althusser, isn't to abandon knowledge. It's to recognize its political dimension. We have to understand that class struggle also happens in the realm of ideas. Knowledge can be used for domination, but it can also be used for liberation when it exposes, questions, and breaks apart the structures of power. So yes, for Althusser, knowledge is always ideological, but that doesn't make it invalid. It just forces us to ask, whose interests does this knowledge serve? Who benefits? Who gets silenced? And you? Have you ever wondered if what you've learned as truth might really be ideology disguised as knowledge? Reason is often seen as what makes us human. From Plato to modern rationalists, it's been celebrated as the ultimate guide for moral life, science, and civilization. But David Hume, one of the most influential Enlightenment philosophers, flips this idea on its head with a bold and unsettling claim. Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions. This phrase, from his treatise of human nature, marks a deep break from earlier philosophy. For Hume, reason doesn't drive our will. It doesn't move us to act. What really motivates human action are emotions, desires, and passions. Reason is just a tool that helps us figure out how to get what we already want. In other words, reason doesn't tell us what we should want. It just shows us how to get it. Picture someone who wants revenge. Reason might help them plan how to do it without getting caught. But the original impulse, the desire for revenge, doesn't come from reason. It comes from emotion. Reason shows up after, as a tool. For Hume, this is the core of human behavior. We feel before we think. That doesn't mean reason is useless. On the contrary, it's essential for navigating the world, making smart decisions, weighing consequences. But it doesn't have moral authority. It doesn't make us good or bad. It just serves the desires we already have, whether noble or destructive. This puts Hume in direct contrast with philosophers like Kant, who later argued that morality is based on rational duty. For Kant, duty is born from practical reason and universal principles. But Hume believed morality comes from feeling, from empathy, sympathy, from our gut sense of approval or disapproval when we see human actions. He argued that if we were purely rational, we'd never act. Just knowing something is right or useful wouldn't move us. we need feelings behind it. That's why he said morality is more felt than understood. This idea actually aligns with today's moral psychology. Research shows that ethical decisions often come from gut reactions and are only explained rationally afterward. Hume saw this coming 300 years ago. His view also challenges the idea that reason and emotion are separate. Instead of seeing passion as reason's enemy, Hume invites us to see emotion as the engine of life and reason as the map, and one without the other leads to either paralysis or chaos. Still, this can feel unsettling. If we're driven by passion, what stops us from acting impulsively and unethically? Hume responds, human nature itself. We have social passions, love, compassion, a sense of justice. We're not irrational beasts. We're emotional beings who live in communities and develop moral feelings as a result. So for Hume, admitting that reason serves the passions doesn't diminish us. It helps us understand who we really are and how to act with authenticity. And you? Do you think your decisions are guided by reason, or by passions you only explain afterward? We live surrounded by ideas we take for granted. We believe we understand the world through theories, models, scientific explanations, and thought systems that act like a kind of map of reality. But what if those maps don't show us the world as it is, just as it looks from inside our conceptual bubble? That's the challenge posed by philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn in his landmark work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn argued that science doesn't progress in a straight, cumulative line like we often think. Instead, science moves through paradigms, conceptual frameworks that shape how scientists see the world, ask questions, interpret data, and define what counts as a fact. A paradigm isn't just a theory. It's a shared set of assumptions, a way of seeing and organizing reality, a common language guiding scientific research in a specific time and place. And here's the key point. Data never speaks for itself. It only makes sense inside a specific paradigm. Kuhn shows that when a dominant paradigm starts to fail, when anomalies show up that it can't explain, a crisis begins. That crisis can lead to a scientific revolution, where the old paradigm is replaced by a new one. But this isn't just a logical swap of ideas. It's a shift in worldview. It's like everything changes color overnight. What once seemed absurd becomes true. What used to be science becomes error, and what was heresy becomes accepted knowledge. Kuhn calls this incommensurability. Different paradigms can't be compared neutrally because they use different assumptions and language. Each paradigm creates its own version of scientific reality. The unsettling question this raises is, can we ever really step outside our conceptual bubbles? Or are we always trapped in some interpretive framework that limits what we can perceive and understand? Kuhn doesn't offer a pessimistic answer. He offers clarity. He shows us that all knowledge is situated, shaped by history, society, and language. That doesn't make science invalid. It just makes it more human, more fragile, and more open to critique. His thinking echoes other philosophical currents, like constructivism, post-structuralism, even ideas from Foucault and Wittgenstein. The message is consistent. There's no such thing as a neutral view of the world. Every observation comes through a lens. But this isn't a trap. It's freedom from epistemological naivety. Knowing we see through paradigms lets us question them, break them apart, and open up new ways of seeing, even if we never fully escape every bubble. Awareness of the bubble is the first step to stepping outside it. So science isn't a mirror of truth. It's a historical process, full of breaks, battles, and reconstructions. That doesn't make it less valuable. It just demands intellectual humility. And you? Have you ever questioned the paradigm through which you see the world? Or do you still believe your bubble is the whole world? Since Descartes, Western philosophy has upheld the idea that the self, this I, that thinks, feels, and makes decisions, is the center of experience and identity. I think, therefore I am, became a foundational idea of modern thought. But in the 20th century, this belief started to fall apart. Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault, and Gilles Deleuze all offered different, yet connected, critiques of the self, raising the same unsettling question: what if the self is just a fiction? For Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, the subject isn't a stable, conscious entity. It's divided, incomplete, and defined by a sense of lack. His famous line, "The unconscious is structured like a language," means that what we think of as our self is actually the result of words and meanings that existed before us. Language doesn't just express who we are, it creates us. So, the subject is an effect of language, always shifting, always chasing something it can never fully grasp, what he calls the object are. Foucault goes even further. In The Order of Things and the Archaeology of Knowledge, he famously declares the death of man, meaning the death of the subject as the foundation of knowledge. For him, the self isn't a source, but a product, something built by historical institutions, systems, and power structures. The I we think we are is shaped by discourses from fields like psychology, law, medicine, and even philosophy itself, all reflecting the political and social forces of their time. Foucault doesn't deny that we have personal experiences. What he questions is the idea that there's a true self deep down inside. Instead, he suggests that the self is an effect, not the cause, of power. Our subjectivity isn't natural, it's built over time. Deleuze takes it even further. Influenced by Nietzsche and Spinoza, and working with Félix Guattari, he rejects the idea of a fixed, central self altogether. For Deleuze, there aren't really selves, only flows, energies, and temporary formations. The self is just a stop along the way, a brief moment in an ongoing process of becoming. He sees the self as an illusion that limits creativity. Instead of thinking in terms of who am I, he encourages us to ask, what can I become? For him, identity isn't a fixed label. It's movement, change, potential. These thinkers aren't saying that human experience doesn't exist. They're saying we need to rethink what we mean by I. Maybe the self isn't the captain of the ship, as modern philosophy once believed, but just a reflection floating on the surface of deeper forces: language, desire, power, transformation. So, if the self is an illusion, how do we live ethically? How do we act in the world? The answer isn't in searching for a true self, but in recognizing the forces shaping us, and maybe creating new ways of being that break free from the roles we've been told to play. And you? Do you believe you are who you really are, or just what others told you to be? Since ancient Greece, language has been celebrated as a tool of reason, truth, and rational dialogue. But the sophists, masters of rhetoric, offered a less innocent view. Speech isn't meant to reveal the truth, but to persuade, influence, and convince. And this suspicion became even deeper with postmodern thinkers like Foucault, Derrida, and Lyotard, who argued that all speech in some way involves power and manipulation. Sophists like Protagoras, Gorgias, and Hippias believe truth is relative, and language is more about winning arguments than discovering reality. Protagoras famously said, "Man is the measure of all things," meaning that there's no absolute truth above human perspectives, only many views in constant competition. For them, a good speaker isn't someone who's right, but someone who sounds right. This idea clashed hard with classical philosophers like Socrates and Plato, who saw sophist rhetoric as dangerous. Plato, especially, accused the sophists of corrupting people by teaching the art of appearing wise instead of being wise. But looking back, maybe the sophists saw something uncomfortable. Language isn't neutral, it's a weapon, and those who master it hold power. Centuries later, postmodern philosophers built on this. Michel Foucault, for example, argued that all speech is shaped by power. In books like The Order of Discourse, he shows how knowledge and truth are always produced within political, historical, and institutional contexts. No speech is ever neutral. Every statement reinforces something, silences someone, or shapes reality in a specific way. Jacques Derrida deepened the critique. He showed that language is never stable, meaning is always shifting and deferred. This means there's no final truth in language, and all communication carries the risk of misunderstanding, ambiguity, and yes, manipulation. So, is all speech manipulation? Not necessarily. Recognizing that language carries power doesn't mean giving up on truth or ethics. It just means staying alert. Speech can manipulate, but it can also resist. It can distort reality, but it can also uncover it if we're willing to ask hard questions. Postmodern thinkers aren't denying the possibility of meaningful conversation. They just want to break the illusion that speech is ever purely objective. They ask, who's speaking? From where? For whom? Every statement builds a version of the world, and that makes every statement a political act. Rhetoric, then, isn't just a technique, it's a strategy. And all of us, in one way or another, play the game. Choosing what to say, what to leave out, what to highlight. There is no speech without intention. Even silence speaks. So maybe the problem isn't that speech manipulates, but that many people still believe it doesn't. Real power lies in those who make it seem like they're just informing, while actually shaping thoughts, emotions, and behavior. And you? Have you ever stopped to think about how your own words might be tools of power or resistance? We live in a world obsessed with usefulness. Everything must have a clear function, quick payoff, or measurable purpose. So it's no surprise that people often ask, what's the point of philosophy? Does it even do anything? Interestingly, ancient philosophers would say no, and that's exactly why it's so important. To Epicurus, philosophy wasn't a dry academic subject, it was a way of life. He believed the purpose of thinking wasn't to collect knowledge, but to achieve inner peace. In his letter to Minucius, he writes, "Empty is the word of a philosopher that does not heal the suffering of the soul." So philosophy is useful, just not in the way modern society expects. It doesn't serve the market, it serves the soul. The value of philosophy is invisible to those in a rush. It doesn't generate profit, boost productivity, or offer quick fixes. It slows things down, asks hard questions, and shakes up certainty, which makes it uncomfortable in a world that demands fast answers and practical solutions. Cicero, the great Roman orator and thinker, believed that philosophy is what truly makes us human. For him, it wasn't a luxury for the elite, it was a basic need. And on the ends of good and evil, he writes, "Philosophy is the mother of all arts. From her come all virtues." He saw it as something that teaches us how to live well, die with dignity, seek justice, and honor reason. So if philosophy is all this, why do so many see it as useless? Maybe because its impact isn't as visible as a machine. It doesn't deliver a product. It transforms your mind. To do philosophy is to stop and question the obvious, to resist going through life on autopilot, to ask the questions most people avoid, and that takes time, courage, and a willingness to get lost, before maybe, just maybe, finding something meaningful. And that's why philosophy's uselessness is what makes it essential. It gives us back what we're losing, the ability to think for ourselves. While the world demands efficiency, philosophy invites slowness. While everything seeks control, it welcomes doubt. While the future rushes forward, philosophy makes us pause and ask, why? Maybe that's why tyrants have always feared philosophers, because people who think freely act freely, and people who act freely are hard to control. In that sense, the uselessness of philosophy is its greatest strength. It doesn't serve anyone, only the freedom of the mind. In a time when everything's designed to keep us busy, distracted, and compliant, philosophy is a quiet act of rebellion. It doesn't offer easy comfort, but it does offer something deeper: awareness. And you? Have you ever been shaken by a philosophical question that had no answer, but changed everything anyway? Thank you so much for sticking around until the end of this video. If you made it this far, it's probably because you also believe in the importance of thinking, even when the questions are uncomfortable. even when the answers don't come easily. Philosophy doesn't give us simple solutions, but it offers something even more valuable: the courage to question, to see the world through different eyes, and to not settle for the obvious. If this content made you reflect, I invite you to subscribe to the channel right now. It really helps support this space for free thought, and you won't miss the next videos we have coming up. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, questions, or critiques. I read them all carefully and reply whenever I can. And if this topic resonated with you, share it with someone who might also need to hear these ideas. And of course, stick around. There's plenty more deep, thought-provoking, and transformative content waiting for you here. See you in the next video.